Chapter 29, 50 Years On. In the autumn of the year 1956, our old home in Malvern, which, since my father's death, had been let to tenants, fell vacant, and as my sister and I were both working far away from Malvern and could not leave our work, we put the affair of the sale of the house and its contents into the hands of an agent. When the date of the sale was fixed for a Thursday, I was distressed to think that my mother's Victorian furniture would soon be dispersed, and wished that I could salvage at least a chair or two. I now had no room for more in my little flat, so on the Saturday before the sale I went to see the builder in my village, who was the only person I knew with a lorry, and asked him if he would take me the long drive to Malvern the next day. When we arrived at the house, I took him into it with his mate, and indicated one or two items that I should like to have, and left them to carry the furniture, while I went to talk to our old neighbors. I came out of the house an hour or so later, and was amazed to find the lorry stacked with furniture. The two men had carried out chairs and tables and dressers and cabinets, and I shall never cease to be grateful to them for it. I felt that my mother's shade must have supervised the loading. The pieces were stored in an empty room at the farmhouse for a time, until the farmer's wife asked me why I did not buy a cottage to keep them in. This was a new idea to me. I promptly collected addresses of cottages for sale from the house agents in Banbury, and set out to view them. I fell in love with the first one I visited, in a village in the neighboring county, and the outcome was that in February 1957 I moved into a home of my very own, which I christened Sunset Cottage. I was supremely happy. At Easter time I resigned from the headship of my rural school, and spent the summer term living frugally, and writing my second book, while the thatcher worked on the roof of my cottage. In the autumn I took up another post, not in my new village, but in Staffordshire, where I was to stay with my friend Ellen, and drive home at the weekends, a distance of about 50 miles. My new appointment was to a post as assistant teacher in a boys' secondary school, where I should be the only woman among 12 men teachers. The school buildings of red brick reminded me of Crosby School, and I embarked on my new venture with as much enthusiasm as I had had when I first set out on my career. My joie de vivre was soon considerably dampened. Was it I who had changed in those 30 years? I wondered as I crossed the schoolyard, or was it merely the reaction of the pupils that was different? These boys were not more than a year older than the school leavers of the 1920s, but they were long-legged and long-trousered like men, and one or two of them pursued me with faint wolf whistles. In the classroom for the next few weeks I learned, too, how different was the behavior during lessons from that which I had remembered. My classroom was one of a line of rooms opening off a balcony which overlooked the schoolyard. Inside it, the outlook on the other side of the room was to a railway shunting yard across a main yard, with heavy traffic roaring past every few moments. There were desks for 48 pupils in the room, classes came to me, and when I had a full class, the fellows in the back row had to climb over some of the desks in order to bring their books out to be marked. At the beginning of a 40-minute period of teaching, the boys lined up in single file along the balcony, and they came into the room still carrying on their playground conversations, shouting remarks to each other about their weekend fishing or the triumphant goal scoring of their favorite football team, while I raised my voice in vain. Then perhaps one of the class, whether out of a sense of chivalry or because he really wanted the lesson to start, I never knew, would shout, "Sure up, and let her be heard," after which we might begin. Then when the last rumbles of reluctance had petered out, the boys would settle down and write most interesting English compositions. The headmaster was also newly appointed, and had not yet had time to make himself felt. He was firm but just, and the pupils came to regard him with affection as well as respect. During my first week, I reprimanded a boy for a piece of unsatisfactory work, and told him that he would have to stay in school at 4 o'clock and rewrite it. It took me a little time to hush the outcry which followed this remark. At 4 o'clock I dismissed the class and set the culprit down to correct his exercise. Soon there was a row of faces pressed against the windows on the balcony. The schoolyard down below was empty. I opened the door and said, "You boys go along home." "We're waiting for Dick," they replied. "Then wait at the school gate," I ordered them. The faces disappeared, but after a moment, hearing a strange sound from below, I went to the door again. The gang had now gathered down in the playground, and the boys were making a soft but ominous booing sound. My goodness, I thought to myself, what has happened to English children while I have been out of the profession? The next day, the men on the staff enlightened me. The older boys had to be off delivering newspapers the moment school was over for the day. Sometimes the frustrations which I had to endure made me very miserable. I sympathized with the fellows who found the school timetable out of touch with their own intellectual or non-intellectual needs, and were reluctant to waste their time on studies which made no appeal to them. I myself had never been able to retain what I had had to learn in narrative lessons such as history and geography. More recently, I had been thrilled with the child development theory that children should be required to learn only the subjects which they wanted to learn, and I had been glad to think that teachers were to be relieved of the drudgery of trying to hammer into unreceptive minds an understanding of facts which the pupils themselves found unproductive. Assuming, however, that there must be some seekers after knowledge in my classes, and that it was only that the ones who did not want to learn were perhaps the more vociferous, I would pit my will against the latter until I had to acknowledge defeat. Then I would say grimly, "Very well, I will fetch someone else to deal with you." The teacher in the class next to mine was also the deputy head, an ex-member of the Royal Air Force, and he had a flow of rhetoric at his command, which he could deliver in a way that petrified the younger boys, even when the jargon was incomprehensible to them. I had only to open his door and say, "The boys in 2C are driving me mad." He would immediately leave his class and follow me back to my room, where the boys were now sitting, bolt upright, in an uncanny silence, and with a wrathful frown he would let out a stream of nonsense, ending up with a threat such as, "If I have one more complaint, I'll have you out, yes you, and make your behind sing the national anthem in sharps and flats," after which order was restored. There was only one easy chair in the staff room at this school, and it was soon impressed upon me that I must not expect my colleagues to give up their turns to sit on this chair merely on account of the fact that I was a woman. I might have won the first round in the battle of the sexes by insisting on my right to have equal pay with men. It was useless for me to protest that I had never demanded equal pay, or to ask what was meant by the expression, "the battle of the sexes." They insisted on standing on their rights as equals, so I stood on my rights too. As this was an all-boys school, there was no domestic science department in it, and milk for the after-dinner cup of coffee had to be boiled on a gas ring outside the staff room. Since I usually spent my dinner hour period hectically trying to keep up with the marking of compositions, while most of the men sat at ease reading their newspapers, I took exception to the fact that they had allotted to me the task of making the coffee every day. Since I was the only female on the staff, I suggested that this service should be undertaken each day by the member of staff who was on the duty rots, and when the headmaster endorsed my suggestion, I smiled at their chagrin. But if there were no nightly concessions with regards to chairs, chivalry was not dead. One evening, when I had trouble starting my car, the headmaster and 3 of the staff ran up and down the playground over and over again, trying to push me off, and I thought they were heroes. The weekly journeys to my cottage gave me the opportunity to gain much-needed experience in how to drive a car, but the tendency to shave bits off my garden gate, for instance, or to reverse into concrete posts, remained with me for some time. One school day, seeing one of the masters waiting at a bus stop, I offered him a lift. He accepted my offer, but as I threaded my way through the traffic, my passenger's face grew progressively whiter, and his subsequent comments in the school staff room clouded my reputation as a driver. On Monday mornings, the men would inspect my car, walking round it to count the fresh dents. But when one day I announced that on my way to the cottage I had inadvertently found myself driving on the wrong side of the newly constructed M1 and extricated myself without damage, they declared that my guardian angel must work overtime. I was inclined to agree with them. My little troubles had never involved injury to anyone else, nor to myself. I did not depend upon safety belts. I just started every journey with a prayer. "Bless this car, O Lord, today, and protect me on my way." I would chant to myself, in tune with the hum of the car engine, or "Heavenly Father, let me feel your direction on the wheel. Bless this car, O Lord, tonight. Keep me safe till morning light. Or anything else that occurred to me. When I came to school, however, with the story of a misjudgment during the holiday which had caused me to overturn the car on a Welsh mountain road, one of them said, "I don't know how you escape death." "It's perfectly simple," I said, and they looked up expectantly. "I start out with a prayer." "A prayer?" someone exclaimed. "What do you say?" "I say, bless this car, O Lord, today." I began, but before I could give tongue to the second line, the woodwork master chipped in with, "Make everybody get out of the way." I had a happy time at this school, in spite of the frustrations. The boys were generous and open-hearted, and when they got to know me better, they were liable to be as uninhibited in expressing their approval as their disapproval. Surprisingly, they liked poetry, and when one day I ventured to write a poem of my own on the board, they said, "You've forgotten to put the name at the bottom. Who's it by?" I wrote my own name at the bottom, and there was a moment of silence. Then one of them asked, "Did you write it?" "Yes," I replied. He stood up. "Teacher's a poet," he said. "Hip hip, hooray!" shouted the class. Chapter 30. Scunthorpe Revisited. After 3 years of alternating periods of hope and despair in my attempts to teach the forthright Staffordshire lads, I suddenly came upon a teacher's wanted advertisement for a post in a school which was much more easily accessible to my own home, and I responded to it at once. A week later I was interviewed in this newly erected, palatial-looking building. The school staff room was a long upstairs room, furnished with several easy chairs, which commanded a spacious view of green playing fields bordered by elm trees, with a glimpse of a reservoir in the middle distance. My application was successful, and before I left, I was shown round the building. I had never seen such amenities in any school. There were 2 domestic science rooms, a superbly equipped gymnasium, a large assembly hall with stage and dressing rooms, and full lighting effects, modern metalwork rooms, science and biology laboratories, photographic dark room, needlework room, television room, music room, and all the other subject rooms. On the asphalt playgrounds below there were netball pitches and tennis courts, and on the green grass beyond them I saw Ruger and soccer pitches, and a hockey pitch. The classrooms were surrounded by low-silled windows, and most of them had a storeroom attached. It was obvious that my methods in this educational palace would be quite different from those I had used in my little backwoods school. Here, with a succession of classes of 40 children at a time surging in for lessons, which recurred at weekly intervals, I could not hope to achieve the family atmosphere that I had enjoyed so much in my log cabin school, or get to know my pupils and their backgrounds as thoroughly. And in a staff room, where 25 of my colleagues congregated, when off duty, it would take me a long time to develop any depth of relationship. I found there was, however, a general attitude of friendliness in the school. This was probably a reflection of the personality of the headmaster, who was always accessible for discussion with members of staff, parents, and pupils. He did not worry us by hovering about our classrooms. He left us to get on with our job. But he had a pretty shrewd idea of what was going on. If there were jealousies or antagonisms among the teaching staff, they were not discernible, and the tensions which might develop in a women's staff room were resolved by the laughter which was likely to follow the men's light-hearted comments on our discourse. How on earth shall I keep Senior Remove occupied all the afternoon? Some nervous young teacher might ask. The men had a ready answer. Give them a yardstick and tell them to measure the perimeter of the playing field, someone would suggest. One of the men, reading the newspaper at his ease, says, "They're going to put a tax on cats." "We don't often eat cat at our house," is the comment. The biology mistress, gloomily meditating on the reorganization of the inhabitants of her aquarium, asks, "If I put the red sword tails in with the green, what will I get?" "Rainbow trout," is the immediate answer. We are going to have to produce a natural history magazine every term with the pupils' own observations in it, she continues. "When I was at college," interposes the art master, "we had to make a study of the local town. Do you know what subject I chose? Pubs." The biology mistress is still busy with her thoughts about the aquarium. "Should you have catfish on the bottom?" she asks. And her neighbor replies, "Well, I've heard it's a very nasty complaint." The physical education enthusiasts are discussing dangerous sports. Once I saw a fellow in hockey get his zygomatic arc broken and his eyes popped out, says one of them. "Zygomatic? How do you spell it then? Is it anywhere near the metatarsal arc?" "No, I think it's in Cheshire." In the year 1962, I received a letter from the headmaster of the school in the parish of Crosby, Scunthorpe, which my father had opened in the year 1908 and directed until 1933, asking if I had a photograph of my father which could be displayed in the school. I learned that in the first 50 years of its existence, Crosby School had had only 2 headmasters. It was arranged that I should go over to present the photograph in person and talk to the present pupils, and that he would invite parents and old boys to an evening meeting at which I could renew acquaintance with old friends. I spent the weekend in Scunthorpe, in the home of a friend of my mother's, and on Sunday afternoon she and her husband took me round the countryside to revive memories of my childhood. We drove to Walkereth to see the house in which I had been born. The once pretty garden was now only a muddy patch, pocked with footprints of the hens which were scratching there, but the leaves of the poplar trees still rustled on the river bank. In Scunthorpe itself, the early home I remembered was now occupied by a transport firm, and the green lawn on which I had played with Tips was buried under the concrete floor of a big garage. The latter home, which I had designed to afford maximum enjoyment of the extensive view, was lost in a sea of crescents and avenues which layered down the hill obstructed from view everything except the neighbors' chimney pots. There were many other changes. The gypsy lanes and primrose woods of my memory were now covered with miles of houses, attractively maintained homes surrounded by gardens. The old slag bank skyline had been magically leveled. The fox hills, where we had gathered wild strawberries on summer Sunday afternoons, were now the playground of the children who attended the new school, built on the site. On Monday morning, I set out for my father's red brick school. As I walked up the street, I remembered the little girl who trod that way in the year 1915, knitting as she went a bright blue scarf for a soldier in the trenches. How proud I had been when the scarf had grown so long that I could throw the end over my shoulder while continuing to ply my needles. I remembered, too, the hateful straw hat which the little boys jeered at, and which I wore reluctantly because I knew that the big black and white striped ribbon bow with which it was trimmed had been contrived lovingly by my mother. Passing the old-fashioned row of houses, I remembered how Ina or Nellie or Nora or Ella would come running to meet me as I returned from afternoon school, and we would soon be playing witches round the builder's shed. When the schoolyard came into view, I saw the angel on the war memorial and remembered how, as a young teacher, I had kept the vases round it full of the flowers which the children brought me. I was greeted by the headmaster, and soon found myself standing in the assembly hall, in front of the children, and talking to them about the olden days. I told them about my escapades on the school roof, and the cowboy games in the playground, and about the adventure magazines in the attic room, which had inspired me with the urge to visit Canada. Then I described incidents of my life in Canada, revealing that I had brought with me an Eskimo to show how the people dressed in the Western Arctic. As the man came round the corner of the corridor, dressed in my fringed, embroidered garments, there was a gasp of awe, until they laughed to see that he was one of their own masters. At night, I showed my own Canadian film to the grown-ups. When the talk was over, I saw a number of people lingering behind, and I looked at them searchingly. A sweet-faced lady came towards me smiling. I could not recognize her. "Do you remember the pheasant's nest?" she asked, and I exclaimed joyfully, "Ina." An older woman came forward and took my hand. "I used to tie the strings of your pinafore when you were 5 years old," she said. "Don't you remember Edith Kirk?" I had been puzzling for some moments over the possible identity of the 3 cheerful-looking young men who were hovering at the end of the key. Their features struck a very strong chord of memory, and whenever our eyes met, I smiled back at them, but without recognition. They were too young to have been fellow pupils of mine. Then suddenly I knew them. I exclaimed with delight, "Why, you're 3 of my wolf cubs of the 1920s, Leslie and Arthur and Billy." And we reminisced about the beds in the straw barn on our summer camps, and the grass snakes in the stack yard, and the thieving little pigs that broke into our store tent, while we went out on a hike and ate all the prunes. Before leaving Scunthorpe, I paid a visit to a house nearby. At my knock, the door was opened by a woman of appropriate age. She had had her mother's features, as I remembered them, and the same dark hair and complexion. She gave me a suspicious look. Excuse me," I said, feeling a little embarrassed. "Is your name Dorothy Mary?" Ash. Yes, she said shortly, and I went on. Well, half a century ago, I used to take you out in your pram. There was a moment of shocked surprise. Then she threw open the door, exclaiming, "Come in. My mother often talked about you. My, you've just made my day." The following summer, my sister and I revisited Louth, and were delighted to find the town just as we remembered it, and to meet again some of our former schoolfellows. Miss Nalder, too, now 81 years of age, was staying in Louth. She was very frail, and her memory was failing, but she still had a clearly etched recollection of the incidents of our school days. It may be true that the days of our youth are the days of our glory, but it is only in age that one comes to recognize that glory. Chapter 31. Food for the Soul. At the beginning of my 5th year in the new school, I saw from the timetable that I had been allotted one teaching period a week with the class of 4th-year boys, known as the Remove. I was invited to give them religious instruction. For 10 years, from the beginning of my career, I had been accustomed to teaching Scripture to little children, who had been so responsive to the telling of Bible stories that this had always been a rewarding experience. In my previous post, the subject had been called religious knowledge, generally abbreviated to RK. There, friction had sometimes arisen in the staff room when the men had insisted that Christian principles had no more virtue than the principles of the other great religions. In spite of my protest that the inculcating of Christian principles should be the first aim of teachers in what was supposedly a Christian country, I have come to wonder if perhaps many of the arguments had been thought up with the express purpose of provoking my counter-arguments, but it was the comment of one of my pupils during an RK lesson that had really filled me with dismay. He was a curly-headed 12-year-old, a typical specimen of English boyhood, and I was discussing the commandment, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," when he asked baldly, "Why do we have to love our neighbors?" I replied, "God tells us to do so," and I prepared to enlarge on the subject and tell the story of the Good Samaritan, assuming that he thought that his neighbor meant the person who lived next door. Before I had embarked on this explanation, however, he spoke again. "What if you don't believe in God?" he asked. My expression must have given some indication of the shock that this remark caused me, because he added quickly, almost indulgently, "Some folks don't, you know." Some folks, I thought. Yes, perhaps, some disillusioned, doubting adults, but never in my experience had a child queried the existence of God. Well, now I was to have the privilege of giving religious instruction to lads who were so soon to be turned out upon the world. Time was short. I entered the Remove classroom on the first occasion with mixed feelings. On the credit side, there was the fact that I should be working with a small class of only about 20 boys. I had heard them referred to as unteachables, so I guessed that their academic abilities would prove to be of a low standard, and as they were all approaching their 15th birthdays, I did not expect them to pay much attention to me. It was a sunny autumn afternoon, No one noticed my entry into the classroom, as the whole class was ranged along the far wall, where the big windows overlooked the playing field. I said, "Good afternoon, boys," and a few heads turned, so I followed up with, "Go to your desks." The single desks were arranged in 3 sets of 10, and each desk had a movable chair. There were 1 or 2 scuffles, as the ownership of a chair was disputed, but there was no hostility or challenge to my authority. Carrying on the tradition which I had learned at Louth so many years earlier, I now asked the class to stand while I said a prayer, and I recited the collect. O God, forasmuch as without Thee we are not able to please Thee, mercifully grant that Thy Holy Spirit may in all things direct and rule our hearts. And remembering how I had once been puzzled by the word forasmuch, I followed the prayer with a brief explanation. A boy in the front row had raised his hand, so I said, "Yes." "Why do we have to say a prayer?" he asked aggressively. "You don't have to say a prayer," I replied. "Do you not wish to say one?" "Well," he insisted, "I don't see why we have to say a prayer. Next week you may wait outside if you don't wish to join in," I said. The following week, when I asked the class to stand, I remembered to say, "Tommy, will you go outside?" He answered indignantly, "What for?" "We are going to say the prayer," I replied. He went reluctantly. After struggling for a week or 2 with such Christian concepts as those enumerated in St. Matthew's Gospel, I came to the conclusion that what these boys needed was not abstract instruction on the Beatitudes, for instance, but a point of departure from which they could begin to become conscious of spiritual things. Surely, I thought, a glimpse of the majesty of God is only possible to those whose spiritual awareness has been awakened by an appreciation of beauty, any sort of beauty, natural beauty, beauty of character, beauty of art, or architecture. I remembered an experience I had had as a newly appointed officer in the garrison mess at Oswestry. A special ladies' writing room had been added to the mess building, and I was sitting there one Saturday morning when the door opened and the colonel entered, with a number of senior officers, on a tour of inspection. As I was the only occupant, the colonel asked me if the women officers were satisfied with the amenities provided for them, and I made suitably appreciative comments. "Is there anything we have forgotten?" went on the colonel. "Well," I replied, "I should like some vases for flowers." "Flowers!" exclaimed the adjutant. "Flowers in wartime! What an extravagance!" "Oh no," I said, "flowers provide food for the soul." "The soul? What's the soul?" asked the major. I looked at him in astonishment. Surely everyone knew what the soul was. "What is the soul?" repeated the major. "Can you see it? Can you touch it? Have I got a soul?" "I hope so," I had said, mentally searching for a definition which might satisfy him. "The soul is the part of you that wants to worship God." Most of the boys in my present class came into school daily from neighboring villages in the county of Northamptonshire, and having myself recently visited Peterborough Cathedral, I conceived the idea of taking them all on a conducted tour of the cathedral in the hope that the memory of this creative achievement of their forefathers might in the future provide a point on which to focus their minds when they were hedging and ditching or mucking out the pigs. When I went to ask the headmaster's permission to take Senior Remove on an all-day expedition to Peterborough, he told me cautiously that he would think it over, and in the staff room my colleagues threw up their hands in horror and predicted that inside the cathedral the boys would park their gum on the lectern and scrawl their names on the stone pillars, while from the bus they would hurl their banana skins and apple cores. With the enthusiastic cooperation of the art master, the boys managed to make booklets illustrated by sketches of different periods of architecture, and on the long bus journey they surprised me by trying to date the village churches we passed by referring to their notebooks. We entered the cathedral by the west door. I had my reward in the gasp the boys made as the vast extent of the interior was revealed. I had had some correspondence with the precentor of the cathedral, explaining the background of my pupils and the fact that they would be leaving school in a few months' time. He met us inside the door and asked the boys to sit in a group in the back pews while he talked to them. Soon their eyes were goggling, and he told the simple drama of the history of the church, from the Saxon foundation 1,300 years ago to the destruction by fire bombs in the 1939 war. After the talk, the presenter led us along the wide aisles of the cathedral, showing the boys the marks of the Danish fires still visible on the pillars, the burial places of 2 queens, the occasional signature of the stone mason in the form of a rebus carved on his work, destruction made by Cromwell's men, and up above the wonderful ceiling, which people came from all over Europe to see. We came to a small door in one of the pillars of the central tower. Our guide unlocked the door, and we followed him, as the children followed another door. This opened onto a gallery from which we could look down onto the people moving like ants on the floor below, and the rows of chairs which looked as though they were made of matchsticks. At the end of the gallery we went in by another door, and continued our pilgrimage up another spiral staircase, emerging at last right onto the roof of the cathedral, where we stood on a railed platform and looked down onto the city. This was the peak of the adventure, in spite of the low-hanging clouds, which somewhat obstructed the view. The mind and the soul having been fed, we now had to consider the needs of the body. I had suggested that we should take sandwiches to sustain us until we reached home again. But the boys had clamored for a knife and fork lunch, and I had been able to arrange for a meal at a cafe in town, fried fish and chipped potatoes, apple pie and custard, bread and butter, and cups of tea, all at a very reasonable charge. Part of the cafe had been reserved for us, and all the tables were spread with white cloths. The boys behaved like perfect gentlemen throughout the day, and there was not so much as a toffee paper left behind to litter the bus. Chapter 32. Retirement. Sunset Cottage is a stone-built, thatched, detached house standing flush with the pavement to the front, and with a small, pretty garden behind. It is situated on the corner of a winding lane, flanked on one side by a row of cottages, and facing a couple of farms across the road. Twice a day, a string of black and white cows saunter past on their way to and from the milking shed, and frequently curly-headed lads drive the tractor past my windows, the trailer in tow equipped with apparatus for haymaking or harvesting, or loaded with muck or water tanks. At first, haunted by the thought of teenage delinquency in industrial cities, I kept a suspicious eye on these farm lads, whose revving motorcycle engines split the Sunday afternoon silences with raucous noises, but I soon found that they meant no harm. One January afternoon, on the last lap of my long journey from North Wales, I approached my village in the face of a blizzard. When I had negotiated the corner into my lane, I saw to my dismay that my path into the garage was blocked by first a wall of snow, which had blown across the gateway, and next a drift half filling the archway into the open garage. A group of lads, strung across the road, was returning from foddering the cattle. They saw my dilemma, and one of them called out, "Come on, lads, let's lift her in." They kicked away the snow, and putting their shoulders almost literally to the wheel, heaved up my little mini-car and deposited me in the garage. I had heard it said that in some rural communities, a newcomer is not accepted until he has lived in the district for 20 years or more. The friendship offered to me in my village gave me a new anchor. It is the sense of belonging which makes the greatest contribution to happiness. Retirement brought unexpected pleasures. I discovered the joy of taking part in those community activities which weave the pattern of village life, turning up as a spectator at the Women's Institute plays and the Tuesday group lectures and the British Legion dinners and the Young Farmers film shows, helping in fundraising efforts in connection with the church heating, attending the harvest supper and the Christmas sale in the village hall, and the annual garden fete and flower show, capturing with my movie camera a record of the seasonal farm chores and Remembrance Day ceremonies, the meet of the hounds, the May Day festivities, and the young wives' party for the little ones, held on the rectory lawn in the summer. A few days after my 60th birthday, I set out from a neighboring village at lunchtime to drive back to my cottage. I had, as passenger, a 14-year-old schoolboy named Trevor. As we hummed down the hill with the wind behind us, the camber of the road threw the car over the dotted line, and I realized I must correct this error before I made the right-angled turn to the left at the bottom of the hill into a lane which was generally deserted. I pulled on the driving wheel with my left arm. Then, as we turned the corner, I saw to my horror that a huge van was approaching at speed, right on our path. I put up a lightning prayer for help, but I had only a split second in which to react. The vehicle, a 6-ton, articulated van it turned out to be, was bearing down on us so fast that it seemed that we should be ground into the tarmacadam. Instinctively I threw up my right arm to protect my head, pulled on the wheel with all my strength with the other, and swiveled in my seat so that my right side, and not my stomach, would take the blow. There was a sickening crunch as my car bonnet crumpled and the van driver's cab towered above us. After a long, jolting ride in the ambulance and a session on the X-ray table, I was wheeled into the hospital ward and rolled into an inviting-looking bed. A nurse leaned over me with a beautiful bouquet of flowers in her hand. "These are from your sister," she said. "That's impossible," I exclaimed. "My sister lives in North Wales." But I read the note on the label, "With fond love from Joyce," and in love and gratitude I fell asleep. During the days which followed, I had time to ponder on many things. What happened now to my theory that my safety in the car depended on the prayer which I recited when I set out on a journey. On the morning of the accident, I had driven along happily in the sunshine with my customary petition, "Bless this car, O Lord, today, and protect me on my way." I had also moved by the beauty of the morning, sung the 150th Psalm to myself in plain song, as we used to do at Louth. Praise God in His holiness. I knew it all by heart, what had happened to the protection which the prayer should have afforded me. For a time I was nonplussed. Then it occurred to me that I had been protected. I had escaped almost certain death, and survived with nothing worse than severe bruising. The explanation for the accident was simple and logical. I had broken the rules, and must suffer the consequences. To make a petition, and then slough off one's responsibilities for helping to implement it, is not prayer. All we need to do is to ask God to bless our project, to work our hardest to achieve the result we crave, and then to carry on, knowing that whatever happens next will be right for us. It is a question again of tarrying the Lord's leisure. It is to be expected that after spending a lifetime in her profession, a teacher during her retirement should be much occupied with the memories of her pupils, especially if she is an unmarried woman with no children of her own. The memories which were most vivid in my mind were those of the 2 years I had spent in the valley of Big Bar Creek, where the number on roll was a mere dozen, and the age range so wide that I could regard my pupils as my family. One day during a summer vacation in Vancouver, when I had been riding in a bus, a talkative woman beside me sat extolling the virtues of her wonderful children. Suddenly she asked, "Have you any children?" "Yes," I replied, without hesitation. "I have 12. "My," she exclaimed, looking me up and down with a new respect. "You're young to have 12. And I had to keep my laughter to myself. This year, 1967, was the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Dominion of Canada, and the centennial was to be celebrated by a huge exposition in Montreal, and special festivities throughout the Dominion. So when, early in the year, I received an invitation to visit my Vancouver friend, Ron and Evie, I decided to accept the kind invitation. I left London Airport on a misty afternoon at the beginning of May. We flew northwards first through the murk of industrial England and then towards the Hebrides and Iceland. We climbed so high that there was nothing to see below but blue space, with here and there a wisp of white cloud passing by. As we approached the coast of Greenland, the pilot brought us down so that we could see the line of the land like the edge of a map. Soon we were heading for Baffin Island, and for a time I was puzzled by the dazzle of a streak of light from below, until I realized that it was the reflection of a beam of sunlight from the frozen sea. We were cozy inside the plane, but the pilot informed the passengers over the intercom that the outside temperature was 70 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Over the island itself, we dropped again and flew across barren waste. Now and again converging lines scarred the whiteness, indicating roads round defense or scientific research establishments. After we reached Vancouver, I spent happy days of leisure with my friends who would say from time to time, "Let's have lunch on the beach," when cardboard plates and delectable eatables were whisked into a hamper and we drove down a leafy avenue, dotted with flowers of the dogwood trees, to the nearby beach, almost deserted at this time of day. There we would sit in the sunshine while Heather and Susie, two loving little 4-year-olds, played with the sand and gaze across the blue water at the forested mountain ranges, still capped with snow, while log booms propelled by tugs floated by, and an occasional shining white ocean liner from the Orient moved majestically towards its berth. Big Bar Creek is situated about 300 miles from Vancouver. When I learned that a daily bus now passes through the town of Clinton, I booked a seat for the outgoing journey on a Friday at the end of May. The bus set me down soon after noon. I was surprised to find the dusty main street thronged with cowboys and Indians, cantering among the slow-moving motor cars full of tourists. I had unwittingly chosen the one weekend in the year when everyone from miles around would be in town to take part in the centennial festivities. Most of the visitors had already established themselves in the log cabin motels which lined the town streets and part of the nearby highway. Representatives of Big Bar Creek were there in force, and I was made welcome in the teacher's motel, where I was soon renewing acquaintance with my former pupils and their sons and daughters. The ceremony of the crowning of the May Queen was already over, and the Queen and her attendants, wearing long gowns and capes trimmed with ermine and carrying dainty baskets of red roses, came into the motel and retired to one of the bedrooms to change into check shirts and jeans. Cooked chicken portions were handed round to the assembled company, who sat wherever they could find a space, as the room filled with friends and neighbors. Soon we were on our way to the Stampede ground, a dusty arena on the bald hillside. As we walked from the car park to the grandstand, I searched the faces of the crowd to see if I could detect any familiar features. Cowboys on horseback were leading away their mounts after taking part in the latest event. I looked up at once when I heard someone say, "Why, there's Douglas." Douglas was the pupil whose image had remained with me the most clearly. He had been 9 years old when I first took over the log cabin school, a little boy with a charming smile and a will of his own. He could catch little trout in the creek in dozens, and his eyes would shine when he told me about it. He was also a bit of a rebel. Sometimes in school he openly defied my authority, but when he was happy he had a most endearing manner. I knew he had difficulties at home, and I hoped that stability in school might help him to overcome these. I looked up then to see that the little boy had grown into a sturdy man, riding towards us with another horse in tow. "Hey, Doug," someone called. "Do you know who this is?" Douglas looked me up and down and shook his head. "It's your teacher," they said, "Miss Taylor." The man's eyes opened wide. He dropped the reins on the horse's neck and slid to the ground. Then, disregarding the crowd, he strode towards me, threw both his arms round me, and kissed me. "Miss Taylor," he said, taking my hands, one in each of his, and holding me at arm's length, "you're much older, and your hair's gone white, but you sure look just as nice." He then turned and remounted his horse, and was gone. I watched Ralph and Floyd win honors at the Stampede, and at the dance that night I met Viva again, dark and handsome in her apple-green gown, but I looked in vain for some of the others. The slenderness of my resources, in time as well as in money, prevented me from spending another night in Clinton, but to me the tribute which I had received from Douglas had made my journey inestimably worthwhile. By the beginning of the year 1968, I knew that there was something wrong with me internally. For the past 2 years, I had been subject at intervals of 2 or 3 months to violent and prolonged attacks of vomiting. I had lived in the hope that each attack would be the last, and that I could cure the condition by dieting. And after my long visit to Canada in 1967, unmarred by an attack, I had rejoiced to think that everything was under control. Then the old pattern repeated itself, and an X-ray revealed that my stomach was squeezing its way through the diaphragm into my chest. I renewed my efforts at dieting, but when the vomiting struck again during the first week in November, the doctor had me sent straight to hospital in Oxford. There followed a week of exploratory examinations, blood test, heart test, injections, X-rays. Then the doctor told me the facts. 3/4 of my stomach was in my chest and must be returned to its place. This would involve a major operation for hiatus hernia. I had been whisked into hospital so quickly that most of my friends were unaware of my trouble. By the time they found out, I was too far away for them to be able to drop in and give me their good wishes, so I began to receive get-well cards by every mail. It warmed my heart to know that I had so many well-wishers. When I knew, too, that the rector was offering prayers for my recovery in the services at the village church, confidence welled up in me. I felt as if I was wrapped round by a protective belt, and my misgivings evaporated. The next day I signed the document authorizing the operation, and when I woke up in the afternoon it was all over. 10 days later my stitches were removed, and I was sent to a charming country cottage hospital for a period of 2 weeks' convalescence, which was extended by a further stay in the home of a friend. By Christmas, I was staying with my sister in North Wales and receiving congratulations from all sides on my obvious return to good health. Today, I feel young again, with leisure to follow my own interest, to enjoy the lanes and the fields, to sit in the garden in the summer with Rex, my neighbor's Labrador, who is now too old to go for country rambles, to talk to the children who pass my door on their way home from school, and to repeat to myself my own psalm. Thank you, my God, that you have brought me forth, not by still waters and through pastures green, but up the lonely and precipitous path which leads to summits tranquil and serene. When the road gaped before my eager tread, and I plunged headlong into the abyss, you wove a lifeline from my slender thread of faith in your unchanging faithfulness. Now I can see the purpose and the goal, which by the present pain had been obscured, and marveling at life's symmetric whole, rejoice that, having doubted, I endured. The 25th of January, 1969.